Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome Eric Parry back to the AA. Of course, it's not the first time that Eric is giving a lecture here. But I feel that in some ways tonight is a particularly special occasion. It's almost 25 years ago that Eric and a few other people, Dalibor Vesely, who's here tonight, Peter Call, myself, were part and parcel of a group of people working around the diploma unit in Diploma Unit 1, thinking about places like Kentish Town and urbanism and the city. And somehow it seems that tonight now, with the publication of Eric Parry Architects Volume 1, hopefully there are lots of other volumes to come, that we are witnessing really the first kind of substantial evidence of the last 25 years of work that Eric has been involved with. And I think I find that personally something incredibly wonderful, and hope that, as I said, there is a lot more to come. I think Eric's work, for me, is something that is quite different than many of the other contemporary practitioners of architecture, because it's quite hard to place him in a particular kind of box, if you like. I mean, I think he's not quite in the same, doesn't work in the same way as people like Foster and Michael Hopkins, nor is he somebody who works in the same manner as what you might call the minimal tradition of architects and practitioners. From the beginning, he's obviously been very much involved with urbanism, but also with art, with contemporary culture, and working with many artists. He's an architect whose work is very much of the present, contemporary, but is not afraid to delve into the past. And I think that is one of the things that for me makes his work particularly interesting, because it's always oscillating between a variety of different conditions, and it's bringing aspects of the past to the present. In that sense, it's also, I think, certain connections between his work and maybe someone like Peter Merkley, an architect who we're going to have here next week with an exhibition and a publication, and maybe that's fortuitous that the two of them would be talking here within a relatively short time. As I said, the book Eric Parry Volume 1 has just been published today, and Triangle Bookshop are going to stay open after the presentation and discussion, so that those of you who are very eager can rush down there, and Eric has promised that he would also go down there if you want signed copies. And the book is available for a special price, so I've done the plug. Eric will make a half an hour or so presentation, and then there will be two responses, the first from Patrick Hodgkinson and the second from Jeremy Melvin, before we open the discussion to the floor. So without any further delay, please welcome Eric Parry.
Moisen, thank you very, very much for that. It's absolutely true that that this is a body of work. The only bubble that I would burst is that you refer to it in the singular, and actually probably the most important part of the development of the work is a collaboration. Because in a way I think one thing on reflection, and that's certainly what putting a book together forces, comes to mind, is that as a practice we haven't emerged from one of the large offices in London. I've never worked I have worked for my part 3, I'm happy to say, but apart from that I haven't worked in another architect's office. So actually the root of the work is very definitely through conversation with colleagues, and particularly with colleagues and students at Cambridge, particularly over the last 15 years, and then more latterly a little bit at the LSE. But the people who've grown up in that conversation alongside me are absolutely critical. And the book actually, in a way, what we've tried to do is to create a project summary, and as accurately as one can, memory-wise, to mark down those who collaborated and worked on each of the projects, because in my mind that's very important. As far as putting this together is concerned, it stemmed not from a sort of predetermined idea, but actually publishing a group of students' projects in a strange volume about urban artifacts called On Certain Possibilities for the Irrational Embellishment of a Town. That was the meeting of my chance encounter with Duncan McCorquodale of Black Dog Publishing. And that was a very enjoyable, if fraught, experience. And from that, we decided, after its publication, that we would jointly embark on this, and that was about a year ago. So much for the background. What I wanted to do by way of introduction to the work was actually draw some strands together very rapidly in 25 to 30 minutes about scales of making. So in a way it's a lecture in three parts, starting with one particular aspect around the question of detail and actually horizons, which Dalibor has very eloquently talked about in terms of significance in the introduction. And then, so to look at the question of movement through those horizons in the projects. So to draw the projects together through stairs. And then to look at the architecture of the wall and the tension between the interior of these projects and the exterior, and what actually one finds in that tension materially. And then finally, just to talk about some of the larger scale projects that are to do with context and landscape. So you'll excuse me if I go at a fair pace, but that's in order to give time, I hope, to Patrick and Jeremy, who have kindly come to stimulate a response, both from myself and from you. So the first project is actually one of the later projects. I should say that the book runs to about 18 months or 2 years ago, and there was a cut-off through space, but also through the sort of sense in which the practice was developing from smaller projects to larger projects. This is the spa at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Hyde Park. And it's a strange, completely introverted internal world on two levels in the basement. But it's about a sense of arrival, an anticipation of going down to change and to bathe, and to then enter a world of relaxation, and finally the treatment room. So in fact the image on the left is the wall to the treatment rooms on the upper level, with these the granite, just a hint of the granite stair, which is shown here. So this is at the entrance passage down within granite walls that run over water. The steps are just created out of granite slabs, and it's a hint of the world below, very much influenced in a way for me by the whole question of libations and purification, that I gleaned very, very powerfully when taking a group of students to Bombay in 1986, where one realizes the potency and the animation of surfaces, which is so different in terms of its intensity to the experience of Western cities. And actually, in this project, a lot of the work was collaborative with furniture designers, the Azumis, and Stephen Cox, a sculptor who works in Indian stones. And in a way, the palette of reflectivity, which is obtainable with granite, is something that was taken from his work, and we were placing then the work rather than in a museum in this context, which was a very sensual one. So that as one moves down into the lower level, the sexes are divided, and on the left you find the pool in granite. There's a sort of detail that suggests inundation of a skirting, which is cut in an inverted manner, and then the polished granite. So this is the same stone above. Stephen's work placed to one side, and then a steam room which is separated by a glass wall, and the handrail in bronze that you saw above, moving down into the water, which is organized to massage you in a horizontal, vertical sitting posture. Clearly, a long way removed from the sacred nature of purification, but in the society where the secular kind of dominates in this world, still it's the experience of the spa is something that certainly connects to a primal and elemental world that's latent. The next stair is a little staircase very, very early on in the sort of history of the practice for Tom Phillips and his studio. We did studios for Tom and for Anthony Gormley around a shared courtyard. And it coincided with a period of research on the work of Victor Horta for the Masters of Building series. And I retain an incredible respect for this symbolist and intense world of the interior, and its manipulation of material to an end that is kind of disappeared in some ways. But again, the sense of the use of metal and crafting and the finishes and the stasis of the moment that's captured in the paint, the light, an amazing grasp of all these and this is the Hotel Tassel. So this is sort of first moment of its genesis. In a way, for Tom, who obviously is an artist working in a completely different way to Anthony Gormley, who wanted an expansive space, the passage from an entrance space around this column that is inhabited by elements that are powerful or important to him emerges into an interiorized space, because we'd lost the windows to Anthony Gormley. And then there's a further climb to this little space, which is like a portrait painting studio at the top, culled out of very simple materials, and form a part, the sense of moving, the thing that obviously, I think it's a sort of hip-held shot, actually. It's not going to come into focus, probably. It's Gustave Moreau's studio in Paris. This incredible sequence of double-height spaces that are stacked behind a domestic facade. It was powerful in recognizing in the studio the kind of intensity of the interior that separates the studio in a way from a normal workshop, and this little stair and its ascent owes something to that. jumping in scale completely. This is a project, these are the plan and a little isometric of a project in Kuala Lumpur for 30 flats. So it's a kind of cumulative, it's actually made up of 3 plots originally that were colonial plots on which a small villa would have been placed at the centre. A street which I'll come back to actually. And then the question was how to create a sense of interior and calmness off this very busy road here. In fact, it's a very busy junction. And the idea was to create a series of stair halls connected by here a sort of cryptoporticus that runs from front to back, remembering that the condition of climate in Kuala Lumpur as either dry or wet and constantly hot. But these became areas at different levels that related to flats, very wide corridors as passage. And this followed, in fact, a period with students researching these wonderful stair halls in Piacenza with their idea of progression from the external street. So it's a town that doesn't give a lot of this away, but there are 100 fantastic small palazzi that have these passages, stairs running up to Saloni, some of them quite crude, vernacular, some of them incredibly sophisticated. And in a way, that was the idea for the mediation of common space in this scheme in Kuala Lumpur. The idea that as you rise, this is one of those stairs, that off it there's a clubroom which is not enclosed hermetically, it's open to the wind, so there would be a room off it, then there's a landing. There's a sort of sense of ease in the way in which a family will use those spaces in a totally different way to here, obviously. And it's almost about creating openness, weathering, but allowing the wind to move through. It's a very environmental thing. But it's also then about the way in which these vertical elements create a sort of sense of the semi-public in this community space, which is shared around the calm of a small garden at the centre. Stockley Park, on the other hand, this is a building, a pavilion, a kind of glass pavilion that was to be subdivided and let as a sort of seed building, a completely neutral plan, which is a totally different discipline, but one's really only dealing with the public dimension, the entry, the atrium, and the ways in to these spaces. But an extraordinary instant landscape. But the idea was to create something that was not just about circulation in the interior. And the use of the materials, it's actually like the Spa, a building that is very much about water. It's set next to a stormwater retention lake. It's very much about reflectivity, right down to the way in which the marble is cut and sliced in a filmic way. The floor is made of Cumberland slate. It's very beautiful. Actually, when you look down on it, it's like looking into water. It has great depth. And then the slate rises up and comes back to connect to a hidden lift, and with views into the landscape and views into a fictive landscape with a painting now covered on a wall behind us. And the stair is used to define the geometry, to mediate between the geometry on plan. The very simple stringer, so this is a folded metal plate with slate on top. The stringer sinks into it's a very difficult junction, sinks right into the slate, and therefore the handrail, which is here at 900, set within a kind of balustrade height handrail at 1100, just swings out in order that you don't trip yourself on that. But again, I suppose I show another water handrail. This is the termination. It's a fantastic termination on this handrail at the Hotel Tassel, where the wood is allowed to drift away from the metal, just so you get that spring. It's a very beautiful moment. And we didn't quite make it, but there was this sort of sense in which this was meant to just have that little spring in it. But it comes out of the metal handrail that's at the higher level. It just forms round so that you don't trip over the stringer that is allowed to plough into the metaphorical water. At Pembroke, there is a complexity of plan, maybe like Damai Suria in Kuala Lumpur. At the centre of it, at the centre of the two wings, there's a junction that is near a gateway, and the stair there unwinds as it moves into the basement. And it's a stair. It looks very simple. The waste is reduced here by using a full metal soffit sheet, which allows this to float. And then the concrete is, so it's like the bottom layer of the reinforcement, which keeps it tight. And it's whilst the rest of the stone on the walls is a bath stone, this is a beautiful Purbeck with a small internalised court on the left and the passage in to the right. And a domestic stair, I wanted to show one other that is in the book, which is perhaps a little more gymnastic in terms of its structure, but this is the stair in Stuart Lipton's house. He requested something that was more lyrical, and we'd worked through that Stockley stair together after all, and this was a stair at the entrance with his little family space, a study, and then a passage up, and just a reminder of when one remembers the tomes on wreathing and the complexities. Stairs look very simple, but they are a wonderfully complex kit of parts, from the material to the delicacy of the material to the geometry of the material. And here this wreathing was very beautifully made as something that ran through a series of floors. And then finally, a stair of a completely different kind. This was the scene at the foot of London Bridge when we were given the commission to look at the problem of the public space here. This is actually the political divide between the Corporation of London and Southwark. So there's this sort of no man's land. I mean, this is, it is a political kind of battleground in many ways. Southwark had just refused a planning application for a building here. This was built by Act of Parliament to suck and throw commuters back at the beginning and the end of the day, and bore no relation to the sense of the south of London and all that it had to offer. So, you can here see the first scribbles, actually, the idea that one could cut away the balustrade, turn, and create this moment before descending into the space to the south, rather than being totally focused on the bridge. So that's what that's all about, very simple. And then reworking the landscape at that point. And a very strong influence for me with the urban landscape project, particularly the work of Adolphe Appia. This sort of sense of, wonderful sense of materiality of light and passage and threshold. So anyway, that kind of culminates that little section, and I should speed up. The next one was about this tension between inside and outside in buildings, and how that is mediated through material, through shadow, space, thinness and thickness. The most overt of those maybe is the work that over a long period of time we've been just doing on this chateau, which culminates with this piece that's had many guises and is designed actually as that glass element between these two walls is designed as an element will stand there when this falls away, which it's likely to do in the next 100 years. So There's a sort of sense of bridging. And this is an environmental wall that closes down because it's a little gallery space. That is the only opening almost in this entire tower building of 4 levels of rooms. And on the other hand, the idea here on the Pembroke sundial of something that's given back to the street, of taking well-crafted stone and then the craftsmanship of line cutting and letter cutting and all the movement that's involved in creating the accuracy of this piece, which is accurate to 2 minutes, and the reading of it, which is necessary with the equation of time, just using, like hieroglyphs, the wall as a place for graffiti rather than openings. I was saying at Stockley, the wall is made in a way, it's very flat, it's very repetitive with the grid, and I think that here these panels of glass block were prefabricated. They have a glass sheet fiber mat in the middle, and then they were placed in with silicon blocks into a prefabricated framing device, so they become part of the stick system of the wall. This was when he reviewed it, Patrick's comment about being naughty, in that, like Wren at Trinity College Library, you know, the arcuated forms are actually where the carrels are. Here, this is hiding the structure of the space below in order to engage the proportion of the first floor and differentiate it from the ground floor, which is, for economic reasons, sunk into the ground by 750 millimeters. There's more to that, but a very primitive, simple system that required quite a lot of innovation in terms of the carriers and the way it was put together and drawing these trades together, which created in the end a very strong horizontality to the way in which the landscape is perceived from within the building, but at the same time created a translucent wall that was very high in order to let a maximum of light back into the plan. At Pembroke, there was the question of taking the brief, which was for 100 rooms or thereabouts, and trying to work between the historic kind of condition of courts and a way in which one might seek to order a wall with so many openings in it. And actually that comes back to the question of the room, which is very minimal. For instance, the door has a big architrave on the outside, but a minimal bead on the inside in order the bed can be there or there, that one can change the furniture around. This is a room that is like an undergraduate room where an incredibly important aspect was not having a kind of hotel ensuite conference operation going on, that it was just a small basin and wardrobe, and that meant people were sharing the passages, and at the same time to wake up in a room of these dimensions, which is quite tight, I mean standard, as one does at the Moller Centre at Churchill, to a single window felt inhumane, so that the question of how you put 200 openings into a wall and maintain order was a critical issue. The idea of the back-to-back servicing of these rooms, and therefore a wider order and a tighter order, was something that began to figure on the facade. And then the condition of a drained area of fenestration within these bays. So this is working with a wall of about 550 millimeters, so that there's like a gutter that collects the water which would otherwise stain the lintel below very badly. So it's collected and drawn down the facade and over the bottom sill, and then relating that to stone and stone size. Created the tension that culminates with the rhythm of the thicker and the thinner pier of stone. It's a skin of stone. It's a self-supporting skin. But you have the two windows and the bottom element that gives the maximum of light into the space, so that one's able to live in these spaces without artificial light for a good deal of the year. There are obviously other larger spaces that mediate the monotony of the undergraduate room, culminating a lodge at one end and a series of garden spaces on the other. Returning to Damai Suria, which was happening at about the same time as Pembroke, very interestingly, in comparative terms, here in Kuala Lumpur, as I say, it's this incredibly moody, savage weather that is torrential or very dry and very hot. The whole discipline of the facade was one that was about opening the facade to allow a maximum of air movement, so that here we evolved an idea of the large, the rhythm of a frame, and then within that a space that is again it retreats like Pembroke in a sense. It's a series of layers with the handrail overlooking the communal space, and then these louvered panels that are able to be withdrawn and stacked to one side, or pulled and maintained as opened or shut, but always to create air movement which runs back through a living space to the common areas of the stair hall. So you get the sense of the draft running back. At Southwark, it's an entirely different problem of finding this space underneath the ramp to make a glass wall that's a very thin, diaphanous moment between what was a brick retaining wall doing no structural job and the new public area outside. And obviously it's an information wall, so areas of it were frosted in order that projection information or image could be projected on it at night, and that would illuminate that public space. Something that hasn't really manifested itself, but still the light spills in a way across the space at night from the inside. To a fabrication of light box panels that are cappings to the stick system, which is a very standard stick system that is wound in and around the existing concrete structure on the back. So there's this double-sidedness, but when you're inside, the light box projects image, and through it you see the lower levels, the historic levels that are beyond this space. And then to a project which is now nearing completion, which in terms of its function has two parts. It's a building in Finsbury Square. It's a office building of 8 stories and a dimension of about 50 meters by about 35 meters. So it's a different scale. We have nothing to do with fit out like Stockley Park, but there's still an incredibly important discipline to actually creating a wall, an enclosure, a civic wall to a space which is unrequited, which will, I guess, be a very wonderful space in time to come. And so the kind of constraints were clear of a plan which we took very literally. Did not want columns, so these are 15-meter spans with an atrium that you come through to, and bridges, so it can be subdivided and be flexible, etc. The principle was, though, that we maintained a zone of about a meter, and we allowed the tyranny of the office grid to lie at that point on the plan behind. So this is a 1.5 meter grid. We were trying to get a mixed mode a system into it, which developed with Eric Facade engineering to flat panels that would reflect light back onto the backside of these piers, which are piers of stone, so that there is no vertical steelwork on the perimeter, The external line is the load-bearing muscular line of the building, which you can see on the section here, so that transforming the base away from a sort of cour anglais or area, it becomes the piers. There's a setback there to allow light into the lower level, and then these beams are picked up by these precast encapsulated concrete steel sections that are. We don't have time to go into any huge detail, but you can see then that the loading paths sort of set up diagonals, and there were two things that were ordering devices. One was the attempt to create a tripartite breaking of the facade, which is obviously almost twice as long as that in terms of the square, so that there is some rhythm, and that there is a movement down to the entrance at the center. And these just show a series of preliminary studies. These are actually taken from sketches, but then developed into a more final form in this way, in the kind of black and white. But see, naively, there was a sort of sense in which one might work double heights, but once the accumulative load at this point became impossible. So it became better for the constraint and the simplicity of that ordering, which was a communication with Whitby and Bird. It was a marvellous an interesting period. And here, you know, this was using Portland stone. This is about the limit of Portland stone that's not used as a wall with openings, but rather a sense of these prefabricated piers. I'll just show you this. This is because it was difficult to find a precedent for this, we had to build and test these piers. So this is a pier that was that took 250 tons of load, and actually began to crack the elements at the base rather than show any form. I mean, it's a fantastic material that's used insanely with the amount of kind of stainless steel and stuff that goes together with the bathroom tiling of standard office facade. So this is the resulting facade, which is now actually built, so it can be seen. It's still wrapped. But it's that removal, that space. It's a shadow. It's like a time clock too, because as the sun moves around this, it's doing an environmental job, of course, because the stone is acting as a kind of brise soleil and has a capacity of coolth. And then finally, yeah, the perhaps not to be built, but a very nice dialogue with Richard Deacon. I mean, he will be doing something, but this was a sort of moment of inspiration to use an element on the building that might be ceramic and wind its way laoconally, you know, around these piers, and what was always seen at the beginning as sculpture at a point, at a horizon that would be seen across the square, with another one set to the other side of the entrance. So the model, and then I think really very, very briefly, just to talk about the sort of sense of context, because when charged with this, which was a very difficult planning problem, because there was a locally listed building, and the conservation officer had said it would come down over his dead body. He's still alive, but it was. You know, it was a question in my mind about the building and the square first, and that actually the building had to work with landscape. So we persuaded the client to take on Peter and Annalise Latz to look at the square, and I thought it was a very beautiful scheme that they came up with, which was to remove the old bomb shelter that had an ack position on the top of it during the war, and create a sunken public space with an acoustic wall to this very, very busy street, a glass wall, ramps, and two groves, one a sunny grove, one a watery grove, with pavilions here that would then, following an analysis that we did of passage through the square, create next to this new avenue a place to get a paper. There's a restaurant there now, you know, to rehouse that, and actually to take down elements of this stone wall and rebuild them as fragments within this garden. So the genesis of the building was a kind of analysis of the way in which the square had changed in scale and use, and an analysis of the way in which the square might be, and a critique of this building, which had nothing behind it. Actually, it's very well built, but the tenant for this building just didn't want to be entering through a kind of mausoleum door with an image of a building that had clerks in the attic and a kind of boardroom on the first floor. At the larger scale, the working of landscape owes a lot to one or two large projects. This was for a hospital where the landscape was seen as restorative at the center of a complex web of hospitals. We did win this competition, but didn't get to progress it because it went to PFI. But that sort of sense of working with a big landscape was very important, and then leads on to the idea of context and working with a landscape here around London Bridge with a sense of the spaces beyond, the recapturing of the historic nature of some of the passages that had just been removed by highway engineering, and here the environs of the first of all, we started with this the Tourist Information Centre and the steps up at the top, and then this has evolved into a project that takes on an attempt to create a memory of the old warehouses and wharves that cut into this space before Tooley Street. London Bridge, after all, the threshold to London, has completely disappeared in a white-gloved entry to this corporate building. This was a part of a video sequence of analysis of the space before we started working with the design, which has now given on to the tourist information space, public space. It's still the world of commuters, but it has a night life. It has in the tunnel, the last arch of Rennie's Bridge, this light pavement, which is like is a place of reflection on the importance of this space. There is to be a museum of London Bridge off this, and then these are the light lines that just mark those wharves. And one of 9, the only one that's come to realization of 9 gateway projects for Lambeth, which meant the reworking with cycleways of a roundabout that was just one of those wretched vestiges of the sort of English idea of English landscape, of a grass lawn that nobody got to, with a series of really wimpy little trees. And the argument that we made was that we should make this as a very hard surface. These are in sets of different levels of finish, of reflectivity, and that the water that came off these would be wound around the space to a kind of grove of trees that are very primitive deciduous trees, so that there are these 7 trees in an ellipse, and then this undulating landscape of something that's recrafted, so that the verdant is raised into the vertical at an incredibly important moment with Lambeth Palace to one side and so on. And this is attached to an idea of creating a kind of a little theatre of steps and seats that look back to Parliament, because it's a key point in the tourist map of London. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to speak for very long, and I'm not going to show any slides. And I want to take up Eric Parry's title, which actually hasn't been mentioned yet, of Matter. I first got to know Eric in the early 80s when I started as an external examiner at Cambridge, a stint that lasted 12 years, examining in different parts of the school. It was then the school's habit to ask examiners to a relevant crit in the Lent term to see work in progress, so that one got to know the teaching staff well. And from the start, I considered Eric's mind important, a factor that has come through to me clearly again this evening. At the end of his introduction, Modernity and the Question of Representation, to the EPA book, which incidentally is lovely, Dalibor Beasley quotes Merleau-Ponty: "What protects us against delirium and hallucinations are not our critical powers, but the structure of our space." Dalibor then explains this by the structure of space has its source in the depth of culture and coincides with overall coherence of our cultural world. Because our existence is always spatial, the nature of lived phenomenal space determines the topography, orientation, meaning, and the sanity of our existence. And that, very neatly being Dalibor, brings me to the contribution to the EPA work I will make this evening. I was an AA student from 1950 onwards, when certain teachers, plus Nicholas Pesner's first book, I threw it out and I've now forgotten the name, about the modern movement, dinned it into us how very important Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace had been for the modern movement, though Paxton himself had never seen the building as architecture at all. He saw it just as a shed. He saw it as a shed due to its materials and advanced design for the mid-19th century, which was said to show progress. Unfortunately, this led many of us at first to disregard the few wise architects of the arts and crafts movement, whereas Mackintosh's Glasgow Art School remains as fit for its purpose now, a century later. Just the same applying to Lethaby's Brockhampton Church in the west, with its reinforced concrete roof, the first of its kind, and Voysey's fine houses, all of them beautiful essays in the art of construction, using materials and methods found locally, without the addition of plundered style. Indeed, when these men's works had then been Bauhaused into functionalism and returned here in the 1930s, those who were still alive let their disapproval be known, because they felt that the soul had been left out. Whereas AA students in the 50s did their 5 years straight through, I spent my 4th year in Helsinki working for Alvar Aalto. And he it was who stressed the importance of those arts and crafts architects I've just mentioned. So that when I returned home, I immediately studied their buildings, and I continue even now to do so. It was Aalto who remarked when he received the gold medal in 1957, new movements tend to begin with enthusiasm and end with dictatorship. The dictatorship's already happening as he spoke this truism. The term matter has many meanings, according to my dictionary, from a physical substance in general, as distinct from mind or spirit, to material for thought or expression. I guess Eric would have had the latter in mind when using it as a title for his lecture, but I don't think the former would have been excluded. As we cogitate upon the various purposes of different projects, we find no one-eyed way of seeing architecture. In his introduction, Moyson mentioned the difference between the work of EPA and many other offices, and I think that's absolutely correct. I guess Eric would have had the latter in mind when using it as a title for his lecture, but I don't think the former would have been excluded. As we cogitate upon the various purposes of different projects, we find no one-eyed way of seeing architecture, but rather a subtle multifariousness tailored to fine reasoning that may or may not be there when initial sketches are prepared, but are brought together as each project progresses. What finally makes them click, however, is a straightforward approach to both structure and construction, down to their smallest details, which happens also to be delightfully poetic. That is certainly what those arts and crafts architects taught me. And where it is poetic, it tends, as much as anything can, to become relatively timeless. This is, of course, a way of thinking about the making of buildings as old as the hills, but strangely rare to find done excellently today. I'm not surprised to find that Eric, while working on the Château de Paula, the ancient and later ruin in the south of France, has found his thoughts about new buildings EPA have designed have sometimes been affected by the chateau's stonework and masonry. It is simply a logic that rail craftsmen used, almost without thinking, to put materials together in ways that made great sense. A logic that doesn't come from books, but what, rather from that more natural sense, feel. That brings us back to Dalibor's quote in his introduction, and the structure of our space. You will be able to see it for sure in EPA's facades, in all their calmness and glory, of 30 Finsbury Square. Although these are entirely new in constructional concept, they possess an extraordinary inevitability. So my message may seem simple, but as many of us know quite well, achieving it is not at all easy. Thank you very much.
In trying to think of ways in which one could encapsulate something about the work of Eric Parry, while reading Dalibor Vasley's very eloquent introduction to the book, I was reminded of some lines from T.S. Eliot's great poem Ash Wednesday, written in 1930. Because I know that time is always time, and place is always and only place, and what is actual only for one time, and only for one place, I rejoice that things are as they are, and I renounce the blessed face, and renounce the voice because I cannot hope to turn again. Consequently, I rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. Now, what Eliot, I think, is describing there is a world beyond the wasteland of modernity, perhaps a world related to Dalibor Vasley's, what he terms the grey zone of modernity in his introduction. But this is a world which has optimism. I think this is a critical thing. But that optimism lies within the compass of the individual. It's not something for which there are givens. It's something that is utterly dependent on the way the contingent conditions are manipulated and put together. So what is it that Eric constructs upon which we can rejoice? Well, we've seen some of the buildings which he's done, and of course there are more in the book, and there are more which are too late for the book, and there are more, we hope, to come. And I don't want to talk so much about the buildings themselves. I want to talk about what I think underlies these perceptions. And I think because the message of Eliot, that extract from Ash Wednesday, I think, is that perceptions are not just all right, but they are all we have. It's only out of how we perceive and how we interpret the world around us that we can begin to construct something upon which we can rejoice. And I think in Eric's hands, we have the use of materials, stone, glass, metal, and others. But those are not just lumps of matter, they're not just stuff. They are elements which have particular characters. And it's those characters which actually give them life. It's the way in which they are perceived. And beyond the way they're perceived, the perception turns into something that's active and something which is communicable and communicative. The climate, of course, the climatic conditions are also absolutely crucial, I think, in the way Eric designs. But it's not just the sunlight angles or the solar gain or the wind or the rain or keeping those out, although those things are all very important. But the climate and the movement of the climatic change is something which is there to be brought out and to be celebrated, something upon which we can rejoice. And I think that perhaps the clearest example of that is the sundial at the Pembroke College building, which is, of course, a way of making the movement of the sun something which is both interpretable, but also actually rather useful. It's quite useful to sell time. We may have devices that mean we don't need sundials so much anymore, but it's a way of making that perception of the sun into something that can be understood, perhaps, and interpreted. But I think this is also where you get an interaction of different levels, because the monument at Southwark, the inclined stone spike, looks as though it might be a sundial, but actually isn't. I understand from Eric that it doesn't bear any relation to telling the time by the movement of the sun. And where that develops its significance is from the way it's used, from the patterns of movement around it, the diurnal flow of commuters, which is fairly regular and fairly uniform, but also the extraordinary way in which it's become a venue for skateboarding which is about the instantaneous thrill. There are some extraordinary photographs of that, with the skateboarders in mid-air, detached from their skateboards, but it's as if they are, actual, if we can go back to Eliot, only for one time and only for one place, an absolutely unrepeatable image caught by the camera in an instant, a fraction of a second. And then I think the idea of how something is used becomes extraordinarily important. And I think that it's in the interaction of these perceptions, the perception of material, the perception of place, the perception of climate, the perception of use and of functions, that all these things are drawn together and that they become the architecture. The architecture isn't just the proportional systems, the construction, isn't just the use. It's actually the way these interact. And I think this leads on to something which is extraordinary, and really the point on which I want to conclude, which I think is best characterized in the acute family resemblances, but also distinct differences in the way the facades are treated at the Damai Suria apartment block in Kuala Lumpur and in the Pembroke housing. And the Pembroke student housing, where the wall is a condensed artifact. It itself, just by looking at it, particularly if one knows something of construction, one can begin to interpret how the whole building works, and indeed the sort of lives that might be lived, the possibility at least that building offers for the lives of the students and others who live in and around it. In Kuala Lumpur, we don't have this condensation, which of course would be the condensation of everything into a 550 millimetre wide wall, but it's extended, it's spread out, that the nature of the climate and perhaps the different sorts of patterns of living that people who inhabit those apartments would have demands perhaps a flow and an interaction of movement. And I think that one of the extraordinary things for me about Eric's architecture is that it is able both to be a representation of itself, almost a stylization of those possibilities, as in the Pembroke facade, but it is also able to fill those possibilities beyond itself. And I think it's that, that existence on the cusp of being the representation of itself and the realization of itself that gives the work its extraordinary charge and power. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Patrick and Jeremy and Eric, maybe if you could, is that the plan? That maybe we could try and open this up. I don't know who would dare, after those two responses, to to now ask Eric any questions, but I'm sure, I hope that you will. If not, I'll have to do it all by myself. Eric, can I just give you the mic? And one thing that I think would be quite interesting, I mean, I don't want to influence the discussion, but I think it would be quite interesting to try and also, maybe especially from the floor, to open up the discussion more in terms of what it's like to practice within a kind of contemporary context, because obviously the presentation and the responses have been very much focusing on Eric Parry Architects in a way. And now I think it would be also maybe quite interesting to make this thing slightly a larger picture where you're also operating within a contemporary context. What does it take to work in this way, especially in the context of the arts and crafts movement, for example, that Patrick referred to, and the notion of a kind of group of people. Is this something that is office specific, or is this something that goes to a wider kind of group of people in London in terms of urbanism, in terms of the way that one engages with contractors, with issues of sort of how to build buildings and so on and so forth, which maybe that hasn't been touched upon so much, but that might be something that, I don't know, Eric, whether you might like to start with that, or anybody else would like to ask a question. Why don't you try and go with that, and maybe somebody else will ask.
Yeah, well, I'm uneasy at the kind of suggestion. I think it's very important that it is a group of architects. It is not singular. It is very much born out of the consequences of urban thinking and European urban thinking, rather than perhaps that's something, a phenomena in this country. And I think that absolutely goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, that the basis of it was of the thought that is now evident in the sort of struggle to make buildings in contemporary world of construction and construction law, etc. Is the very, very fecund group of disparate opinions about the city that existed in the AA, particularly in the years sort of that I knew, at 78 to 80, so that conversation has continued and remains an absolutely key starting point for any thought about a building. So instead of, it's certainly the buildings are not, if you like, object buildings. Partly, obviously, because the commissions that we have had have been either domestic, and there's a particular scene in London, or they have been commercial buildings, worlds that are dealing with leisure and the public realm in London. So there are no monumental buildings, no big public buildings. Some competitions have informed the idea of accessibility and so on. But in that instance, one is not formulating space around an object, but actually manipulating the building to respond to its various conditions. I think that has been incredibly important. That the richness of that debate at the AA at that time was also one that I think gave a very good ground to begin to grapple with the commercial world, for instance, removed as it may have seemed. the kind of arguments, the structure, then taken to what is, after all, making up 90% of the city, the commercial world, is an incredibly important one that perhaps hasn't been given due respect. And I think, therefore, that is a particularly satisfying area to begin to work with. So I don't know, but that's certainly the basis. The basis is in the condition of the context of the buildings.
Okay. Do you want to say? Does anybody have any? Who's gonna ask a question now? Patrick? Yes, at the back. Can we give you a mic so that people over here can hear you?
How you doing, Eric? One question. If you had to distill everything down to one single factor, and only one, that motivates you, what would that be? And only one. It was just the primary factor and thing that motivates you.
Well, you know, it's
Don't save money. The
translation of idea into building, if it's possible. The collaboration ensuing.
So there. Go ahead, please.
Eric, it's a question about one of my full admiration of things that you've been talking about. You've talked about, as I said, the parts of things, parts of buildings. We're very interested in building now. Become really engaged, and the stonework is very fascinating the way you've worked it. But you haven't talked very much about the spaces, the kind of bigger context in which these parts are found. Is that a deliberate evasion? Or maybe you think it might be an unfair comment?
No, I think it's a very, very fair comment. But I mean, it is actually mostly, I think, to do with the fact that the evening's been truncated. But there aren't a lot of complex, large spaces that we've been involved with. I mean, they are the spaces between the multiple of others, or the evidence of urban kind of fabric that's creating enclosure for urban space and urban use. I think that the Welsh Parliament began to be a building that was a much more public building as a sequence of larger vessels, and would have led to an engagement between the public realm of the street, if you like, and those rather bigger spaces that we haven't really had to grapple with, because after all, but the passages are there. I have you know, with each of the projects there is a sequence that would be another story actually, because tonight has been about something very specific in terms of levels, the vertical and the horizontal, and not, as you say, the spaces between and the way that those are structured and ordered. So I think it's another part, but maybe an unrequited part.
But some of the space, I think, one thinks of the Pembroke staircase, although it's quite small, it actually contains the essence, as it were, of certain attributes of public space. There's somewhere to sit, there's somewhere to meet, there are places to move, there are opportunities to move out of the space and come back into it. And I think it's the way that spaces such as that carry a sort of mnemonic trace of something that is much bigger and grander that's quite interesting. And maybe this will develop with Finsbury Square and other projects where, you know, clearly the physical limits are larger than they are at Pembroke, but the ability, I think, to capture the essence of those larger spaces and put them into smaller spaces, or perhaps a spa as well, does this. It's something that I'm quite intrigued by.
In some ways, I find the question slightly odd, because I mean, what I liked about what Eric told us tonight was not just, it wasn't just running through projects from start to finish kind of thing or anything like that. We saw some of them more than once, etc. But it was really about, I mean, to me, it was about making. And that's, for myself, that's enough for one lecture.
Maybe I know that that Derek is waiting downstairs patiently for people to go down there and buy the book and for you to sign the book. But maybe by means of a segue, you were telling me a few days ago that when you were making the book, you had to, or you went with the designer and with some other people to have a look at some of the projects. And I think it's interesting, the whole idea of sort of constructing the book in a way, because the people who make the book are different than you, even though, of course, there's a very strong relationship. You know, it's the sort of book that you want. But it's not quite the same as the building. So in some ways, the question of their reception, what they understand the work to be, because when architects describe their work, they describe it according to what they think it is, and even if it's not, in terms of its perception, they're often insistent on describing it according to what they think, how it should be perceived. What did you learn from the graphic designer or Duncan or whoever else's perception?
It's like another project, actually. And I think I saw Paul lurking around the back, but I mean, you know, and it certainly wasn't telling. You know, it was a dialogue, and his contribution was sometimes stubborn, but very creative and changed. You know, the conversation about the whole question of typography and whether this was we spent a day together going to a number of projects, and he obviously picked up certain things that we haven't voiced. Just as, you know, Wilfred refused to write about anything he hadn't seen, so we went everywhere, and me as a kind of silent guide. But with the whole question of graphic design and the flexibility of typography, and whether it should be something that was coming from a sort of Swiss school or a Dutch school, and what that implied, and how he was going to manipulate it, and, you know, colour and so on, was absolutely amazing. I mean, that was something we kind of touched on, I guess, as students way back, and didn't take very seriously. But suddenly, the full weight of these decisions, as this thing evolved over kind of weekends, principally, you know, it became quite tantalising. So the result is very much down. It's maybe hiding of blemishes and kind of celebration of things that have worked better is very much in Paul Kira's, to his credit, and Duncan, of course, who was there throughout. So it was a very close conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all. Can we all try and find our way downstairs to Triangle and get you to...